Well, C.S. Lewis, the Oxford Don, when he converted to Christianity, he was shocked, quite frankly, that he did that. As an intellectual, he never thought he would believe that a carpenter from Nazareth was the Son of God, come to invade history and redeem people for his glory. And yet, as he began to study philosophically, he arrived at the place of believing in Jesus Christ. And it was so profound an experience for him, he went away to a retreat to a friend's house and over 2 weeks wrote a book about it. And as he wrote the book, it was an allegory, a story about a guy who had a desire for something ultimate, an island where delight and virtue met. And then this young man launched out to try to find that island of desire. And as he did it, he journeys through, in C.S. Lewis's allegory, all the philosophies of humanity. They're these little towns. And so he goes north to the harder philosophies of Mussolini and Stalin. He's like, I don't think this is right. And so then he goes south, deep into the hedonistic and pleasure-filled substance. And he says, I don't think these philosophies are right. And this young man walks around the whole world. And then as C.S. Lewis pictures his conversion, he says this man is driven by sword point, by reason to the church. Didn't want to do it. But he finally realizes, I have nowhere else to go. And in his picture, this man has to dive into this lake. It's a picture of baptism. He dies, but then he rises alive. He's become something new, and an allegiance to Jesus has changed him. He gets a picture of his island, that it's time with God in eternity. And he says, okay, I've believed in him, I've found it, let's go. And they said, no. You can't swim to the island. It's actually not an island, it's a peninsula. The way to get to it is you gotta walk back through the whole earth again. It's like, come on. So he named it the Pilgrim's Regress. No, you gotta leave and go back through the world, but then he is warned by this guide who will now walk with him. Hey, you're gonna go back into the world, but everything will be different because you're different. And as he walks through the world, he sees it with different eyes, and he has to learn afresh, how do I engage society now that I have this new allegiance to a new king? And that was Lewis's best way to try to picture what happens to the Christian. We believe in the event that God broke through history. Jesus Christ was God and man, and he didn't come to condemn us and shame us. He came to rescue us and bind himself together with us in a covenant. And that covenant changes things. I was at a wedding this weekend, and it's such a delight to watch people bind their lives together. And in the Christian understanding of a marriage, it's a covenant. You bind together for better, for worse, sickness or health, until death do you part. And as they do that, when you get into that new allegiance, it changes everything about how you relate to the rest of society. A few months ago, if a boy asked her on a date, she could say yes. Now, if a boy asks her on a date and she says yes, that's a problem. Months ago, he could have made some wild financial venture without consulting anyone, and that's fine. He moves all their money into some risky venture. There's a big talk coming. That the way you relate to money and the opposite sex and your job and your life, everything changes because of your new allegiance to this relationship, right? And that's what Peter's been telling us. Jesus Christ has come, you've been knit together with him. You are the beloved of God, and that makes you different. You are beloved strangers. That as you come to him, it changes who you are in the world. And so now we're entering the section of, once I embrace that identity, what's my new activity? How do I engage the world? How does this new allegiance affect the way I conduct myself in the home, or at work with my boss, or out in the world? And so it's interesting as he moves into this section. I had someone ask me last time, hey, this is great, Ben, you're talking to us about how to know God and walk with God, but what does that actually look like? And I said, well, keep coming, just come back, all right? We're about to show you. And Peter now is going to turn the lens and say, believer in Jesus, as you enter the world, here's how to relate to your family now and your spouse. Here's how a believer relates to their boss if they don't like them, right? And then now he's going to say, here's how you relate to the government and to politics. So we're just going to wade into the shallow end of the pool today, all right? We're going to talk about the intersection of religion and politics. Should be easy. We might even get out early. So you know that's not true. All right. In fact, there's always been friction between these two worlds of religion and politics, right? Augustus, when he was Caesar, claimed that Caesar was God, and that by de facto made him a son of God, right? So if you're Herod and suddenly foreign dignitaries from the east show up because a star showed them that a little Messiah, a king, was born in his region. What do? If you're Herod, you go, whatever you guys are talking about is a political threat. So you murder every little boy under the age of 2. That Jesus' arrival was seen as a threat to the power of those in politics, right? And there's tension there. And as Peter writes this to people living under Rome, there was tension there. Rome, the empire, had done a lot of good. It had created opportunity for success. They had created roads. They had brought relative safety to the region. They cleared the pirates out of the Mediterranean. Beforehand, you were just subject to any raiding band. But now as the empire established, there were rules, there was order, there was structure, so you could travel along roads. You could communicate with others because you spoke a common language. You could trade, and within Rome, there was even suddenly social mobility, that you could sell your crops, and if you were poor, you could actually become wealthy. And so they created the opportunity for success and for safety because they brought stability. There was a court system that if someone wronged you, you had political recourse. You could go to the government and seek justice, that there was a stability and opportunity in Rome that did some good things to a previously wild area. And yet Rome was also brutal, and they would kill dissidents and commit genocide. And the Caesars, boy, they were tough. I gotta say, I decided to read about ancient Rome this summer, just for fun, and I realized as a church history major, I've read about all these ancient authors, but I've never actually read some of them, some of the guys that we know the most about ancient Rome from, Tacitus and Livy and Suetonius. And so I just picked one, I picked Suetonius, and I didn't understand at the time that where Tacitus is maybe the New York Times of the ancient Rome, and Livy's NPR, Suetonius is TMZ. And I'm reading this book and I'm like, whoa. Like all day I told Dawn, I'm like, get this. And one by one, I'm telling her about the Caesars that reigned during Peter's time. I mean, Augustus, he reigned for 40 years and then he handed the kingdom off to Tiberius. And Tiberius then proceeded to kill all his rivals. Then he moved to a little island of Capri and like Jeffrey Epstein, created this island where he would abuse children. And then he pitched them off cliffs when he was done. He was a monster. But he adopted little Caligula, and he would make fun of him because he had killed Caligula's family. And then one day, Tiberius suffocated at night somehow. I don't know, allegedly. Maybe Caligula got over it, and he became king. And the little boy became king, and he was way worse. And he killed all his enemies, and he was a tyrant of the first order magnitude, that he would murder all dissidents, he would invite people to dinner and then take advantage of their wives. He showed up at a wedding, decided, no, I want the bride, interrupted it and took her home so he could enjoy her and then divorced her the next day. He was a monster. And so 4 years later, his guard said, that's enough, and they murdered him out in the streets. And so his idiot uncle became emperor, Claudius. Claudius, when he heard about the murder of Caligula, went to hide in the palace, and they discovered his toes because they were hanging out from behind a curtain. And so the guard opened the curtain, he sat there shivering, and they grabbed him and said, hail the emperor. And he's like, for real? And he wasn't a sharp tool in the shed. And yet, here he was, a god among men. And then he promptly married his niece and then passed an edict saying it's not weird, but it stayed weird. And he was poisoned to death, allegedly, by her because she wanted her son to be in power, her little boy, Nero, who's an emotionally unstable 16-year-old. And when he got all the power of the empire, he promptly killed his mom. Then he killed his wife. Then he got married again, and he killed his second wife by kicking her to death while she was pregnant. Felt real bad about it, so he married a 13-year-old boy who looked like her, kidnapped him, made him dress in his dead wife's clothes, and would parade him around. Nero was a terrifying monster. They went to kill him, and he killed himself first before they could get there. And allegedly, his last words were, you're too late. And it's like, well, I mean, you kind of did the job for us, so whatever, bro. So Rome brought structure. Rome brought stability, but Rome was savage and Rome was brutal. What do you do if you suddenly have an allegiance to Jesus Christ in a culture like that? We sang songs earlier that would have gotten you killed. All hail King Jesus doesn't fly in a culture like that. So what do you do? What do you do when you've sworn allegiance to a society whose vision and values are at odds with the dominant culture? What do you do when you've sworn your allegiance to a community whose vision of what life's about and whose value system is suddenly at odds with the dominant culture? Because that is what the world's like today. And we are not ancient Rome. And yet, Christianity, for some, and many of you know this at your work, it is seen as odd, strange, and now increasingly in the world as bad, even immoral. What do you do if you have an allegiance to Christ in the midst of a culture? In the time that Peter is writing this, persecution of Christianity hadn't become statewide policy yet. But what happened was there was widespread pressure to shame Christians in order to get them to conform to social norms. I know that sounds confusing. Ben, what's that like? Shame is a powerful weapon to threaten people with the loss of status or loss of their job. And so you don't have to censor them. They'll self-censor in order to be safe. That was the world they were in. So question, how do you respond if you're part of a persecuted little group and the part of a bigger group? If you're a little club in the midst of a culture that disagrees, how do you respond? Well, historically, when human beings, when this happens, when cultures collide, you got a couple options. Number one is to attack. You start a revolution. You violently resist the opposing, oppressing culture. I will overthrow your societal structures that support your current belief system, and I will launch a campaign to take power from your group and give it to my group. So in the French Revolution, I set up a guillotine, I kill the nobility. In Russia, we murder the bourgeoisie, right? Up front, I rise up and I take control, and if I kill enough people, I get to decide because I take power. That's one thing that's happened all through human history. Right? Or number two is you don't attack, you assimilate. You go, there's too many of them. So you give up. And you say, I'll just go along with the flow of the culture. And maybe at dinner parties with the right clientele, if the lights are sufficiently dim, I'll whisper what I really believe. But then out in the real world, I will just privatize my faith, and publicly I'll say whatever they tell me to say because I'm scared. Or a third option is I will not attack those who disagree with me, and I will not assimilate and just become part of the culture, but I will transform the culture through a transformed life. I will hold to my convictions and I will stand, and yet I will hold them with gentleness and respect. I will not attempt a coup against you, and I will not conform either, but I will hold my convictions with grace. And if misunderstood, I will suffer, and if need be, I will die well. And it's that third option is what Peter will advocate. And I know some of us hear that and go, that sounds terrible. I don't want to do that. I don't want to hold my convictions, be misunderstood and slandered while I don't defend myself and fight back. That's exactly what Peter will advocate. And so before we dismiss this and go, well, this is dumb, I hope this talk's quick because at least brunch can redeem today. Let me say this. Before you knock Peter's theory, we will not attack, we will not assimilate, but we will transform through a transformed life. We will embody better ideas. Before you knock that system of thinking, you have to ask, is it effective? Maybe it's inconvenient, maybe inefficient in my view, but was it effective? And it's interesting, Jesus met Peter when he was around 30, right? And so Peter was probably around the same. Jesus died in AD 30s, he was about 30 years old. And he never left on this, I think we got a map, he never left this region. Jesus Christ, around AD 30, died right there, never left Judea, Galilee, or Samaria, right? And yet, after he died, his first disciples, from AD 30 to AD 60, within the lifetime of his disciples, they spread the gospel as far west as Rome, and it was on its way to Spain. They spread it as far east as India, south to North Africa, and north to modern-day Turkey, the people who Peter's writing to. That the gospel spread so quickly and so rapidly, little communities with allegiance to Jesus were spreading all over the Roman Empire, so that by AD 110, 40 years after this letter was written, to the same region, Asia Minor, a new governor takes over in that area, and he writes a letter to the king. We have it. You can go online and read it. Pliny writes to Trajan, and he says, I need to get your advice, Emperor. I've taken over this area of Asia Minor, and there's all these people being brought to trial because they're Christians. He said, and I can't tell, is being a Christian a crime, or do Christians commit crimes? But they're being brought to trial, and I don't know what to do. So he said, so let me tell you what I am doing. When they're brought to trial for being a Christian, I ask them, are you a Christian? And if they say yes, I murder them. But if they curse Jesus Christ and worship you as a God, I let them go. He said, but this is becoming a problem. And as he writes the letter, he says, here's why I'm writing it. It's because if I keep doing this, there are so many of them. Men, women, slave, free, high and low. So many people are coming to faith in Jesus Christ. He says the temples of our gods are deserted. So if I keep murdering them, I got a problem here. I would love your advice. Love and kisses, plenty, right? And so he writes this letter to ask him, what do I do? And he says at the end, I think I can turn the tide. I just need some advice. And he was wrong, because Christianity continued to spread and grow, and this allegiance to Jesus swept over Rome, so that by 300 AD, the emperor himself allegedly became a Christian. Maybe he really did put his faith in Christ. Maybe he just saw this philosophy has taken over my empire, so I can't beat them. I got to join them. So this little fledgling movement of Jesus's, of Peter's, it took over Rome. Does this philosophy work? Yeah. Is it tough? Yeah. But you look, and it did just what Jesus said it would do. When Jesus showed up, they wanted him to be a political leader. Rise up, marshal us, and let's take over Rome. And he said, no, I won't do it. He said, my kingdom is not a military coup, it's a mustard seed. It's gonna look small, but keep your eyes on it, because it's gonna become a tree that takes over the whole world. And he was right? And so his theory works. And so Peter launches this global movement that's endured for centuries. So before we dismiss it in our own lives, because the invitation here is to take some hits and be misunderstood, but do not conform, but have compassion even in the midst of conflict. That's a hard thing to do, to decide not to go along the stream, to not try to dam it up, but to stand in the middle of all that tension and refuse to move your feet, but to do it with grace and kindness. That's a hard thing to do in a dominant culture, and yet we're called to it here. And Christianity swept through Rome. Why? Because they had better ideas about the nature of humanity, about the way men and women are meant to treat each other, about who God is, why we're here, what's wrong with us, and how it's dealt with. And those ideas were so compelling, it changed Rome, right? And yet you have to embody those ideas. You can't just profess them. If you have the best idea of how to get in shape, but you're out of shape, no one's buying your workout program. If you're wondering, that's why, yeah. They're gonna look at you to see if your program works. And so here Peter says, we have a program that will save the souls of humanity, but they need to see its impact on you. And so he's talked to us about our identity, now he's gonna give us our activity. You're like, wow, he hasn't even started his first point. Take heart, children, we're gonna move fast. But what we have here, I wanted to give you context. This movement swept through the world and is even now the most dominant worldview on the planet. It's in some ways waning in the West, and yet it's multiplying throughout the globe, this belief in Jesus Christ. And what we're gonna get in this letter, this is the locker room speech of the coach. This is the behind the scenes documentary. This is the last dance. How did they do it? You're gonna hear what coach says about how we play this game. He's gonna tell us our response to Jesus. Then he's gonna give us the role of the government, and then he's gonna give us a resolution to the tensions. But he begins with their identity. We'll move quickly. 1 Peter 2:11, he says, beloved, you are loved by God and by me and by the community. That's who you are. I urge you, so here's theology's becoming activity. Here it comes. As sojourners and exiles, you are not usurpers and you are not victims, but you are a sojourner and an exile. That first word is paraoikios. It means you're alongside the house. You're not in the house, but you're right next to it. The other one means you're walking alongside somebody. So there's a community, but you're near them, but you're not one of them. You live by them, you walk by them, but you're not one of them. That's how the Christians meant to view themselves. As I enter into the community, my most fundamental identity is I belong to Jesus Christ. I am an emissary of a different king. And so then I will reflect a different culture. If you and I walked over to some of the ambassadors in the area, you would expect them to live differently than you because they embody the values of their culture, and yet they live in this one. And he says, you are God's chosen people, a holy possession, a kingdom of priests. You will look different from those around you. You're beloved and strange. That's who the Christian is. And so let me tell you something. If you don't look different than your non-believing coworkers, that's strange. because you expect someone to be different. If they came to you and said, I have had a profound experience where I now have an intimate relationship with the deity who made all, you expect to see some changes in their life. And if they look no different than anyone else, you go, well, then that must not be a very powerful God. But if you are the beloved of the King of Kings, you are dearly loved, and it should make you different, right? And that's who we are. So he urges them, see yourself as foreign dignitaries that embodies the culture of the kingdom. How do you do that? Well, he gives you two things to do, one negative, one positive. You're meant to abstain from some things, and you're meant to embrace some things. As people who have intimacy with the Almighty, it impacts our activity. And so he says, I want you to abstain from passions of the flesh which wage war against your soul. There are things as people who have an allegiance to Jesus, we don't do those things. And notice he says, we don't indulge the passions or desires of our flesh. And so there are things we don't do, not to show that we're special or to show people we're neat. We don't do them. Notice the motivation, because they waged war on our soul. He gives us a personal motivation there. There were things you used to do that were hurting you, and you're not going to do them anymore. But notice he says there are desires that you had that were detrimental to you. Can you have desires in your heart right now that damage you if you indulge them? Yes. And yet there's a popular philosophy right now of just, hey, just go with your heart. Just let your desires guide you. And you go, okay, which ones? The desires to eat a whole box of Twinkies or the desire to be in shape? Because they're both in there and they're both whispering to me. And so when everyone says that, follow your heart, what part of it? Because some part of my heart talks a little crazy, especially as the sun goes down. And so following your desires may not help you. And there may be legitimate desires you have that will be destructive to you. Johnny Cash said it in his autobiography. It was fascinating. He was talking about all the devastation drugs had on his life, how he almost lost his life, how he started a forest fire that almost wiped out a species of condor. I mean, he just had so much wreckage from his addiction to drugs. But then he wrote in there, oh, but I miss him. I love him. And you're like, what? You're not supposed to say that. You're supposed to say, these were bad, these were terrible, and thank goodness the Lord saved me from them. You're not supposed to say, yeah, but it was a fun ride. But he just said, no, that desire's still in there. He said, there's a crazy part of me that every day whispers like, you remember how fun that is? Yeah, I kind of do. He says, and then I have to talk back to that voice, yeah, but you took more than you gave. And so I don't want to listen to you anymore. And so I won't. He says, but it whispers every day. I just say no. I talked to a friend who checked into rehab for sexual addiction. And I remember being so surprised when we were talking about it. And, I'm trying to walk sensitively into the subject because I don't know how he wants to talk about it. But as he's talking about the things he used to do in the past, not in any detail, but just kind of saying his lifestyle, he said, man, I miss it. And he had been sober for years. And I was like, what do you mean? He was like, oh, there was so much about that lifestyle that was fun. I miss it every day. He said, but then I remind myself of the damage done. And I say, these desires, they're going to lead to destruction. So I mortify them. I kill them. You have desires right now, and your friendship group may tell you, indulge them. You be you. You go. You're young. Enjoy your youth. And let me tell you something. Those desires are waging war on your soul. They're taking too much from you. And yeah, we can talk about it with diet, but these words are often used sexually. There's a way to use sexuality that is damaging to you. And the Christian sexual ethic is way more restricted than the cultures. But it's not to rob you, it's to save you. Because every week it seems now you read an article in the culture that says, hey, we have complete freedom sexually, but we're so lonely. Maybe this indulgence of our passions of our flesh is waging war on my soul. And listen to me, I'm not shaming you at all. No one comes in here with clean hands. The prerequisite to coming to Christ is the admission you're dirty. But we come to him and he says, but I'm making you new. I'm making you my beloved. And as I touch you with my grace, you know grace and you show grace. And there are things you used to do, you don't do them anymore. And will that make you weird? Yes. I got a text from a friend the other day. He was telling me when he first went off to college, sweet little Christian kid, got invited to a party. He was so excited. This nice girl invited him and he showed up at the party. She opened the door and they had a bunch of TVs on and there was pornography on the TVs. He said he didn't know what to do. So he just went, ah, and ran away. And we were laughing about, you're like, well, that's an option. There were maybe other ways to address this lady, but you can clean that up later. But there are some things I abstained from. I can't go there anymore. And then he says, but there are some things I do. And I don't just do them for me, I do them for them. Verse 12, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable, so that when they speak against you as evildoers, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day of visitation. He says, keep your conduct honorable. There's some things you do among the Gentiles when you're out in the public square, when you're among the nations, when you leave this place and move out into the culture. He says, do good that they may see your good deeds. So this isn't, I try to hide my good deeds. He's like, no, do things. And notice he assumes a value overlap with the culture. It's overly simplified in the modern world, the way we talk about some of our societies. Well, my political system believes all things good, and yours embodies all things evil. We are the righteous, you are the dirty. The Bible doesn't talk that way. It assumes that every human being made in the image of God has a conscience given by God. They may suppress it, burn it, push it down, and yet everyone has a semblance of virtue and can see something and acknowledge it as good. So he says, actively pursue doing good and do the things that your pagan neighbors would identify as good. So this isn't just passive, try to keep your nose clean. It's active. Be a redemptive force in the culture. Teach kids in the city how to read and build them a library. Step out into the culture and provide for people to get the education they didn't have the access to get the funding they need to launch a business that they didn't have from their family. Get in a situation where you can help people flourish. Help them build a garden so they can grow vegetables in the middle of the city. Be active and love the city you're in. That's why we do it. That's why we love DC, so that they can see our good deeds. So they look at us and go, wow, what a neat group of people. And we're like, I know, right? Had a great mom too. Is that why? No, we're not doing it for us. We're doing it for them, that they may see your good deeds and glorify God. I'm doing it for them, not so they'll glorify me, but so they'll know the God they see displayed in me, because they see the way I treat them. This abstention and activity will confuse a non-believing culture, because your moral purity will often be read as arrogant. They will slander you as evildoers. Do you see that? And yet it's your affection for people that will be drawn to you. And that's been Christianity's history, that we both draw and repulse people from non-believing cultures. Amen? It happens. And it happened in the ancient world. Christians were hated by a constituency of Rome in their day. Tertullian said it. We have a reputation of being aloof from the crowds. They realized we have to abstain from some things. They wouldn't go to the gladiatorial games. They would have slaves and prisoners of war fight to the death for the entertainment of the masses. And the Christians said, no, that person has dignity because they're made in the image of God. And I will not watch the besmirching of the dignity of God for my entertainment. I won't do it. So they didn't get to go. Most parties and feasts were held at temples in the honor of the gods, and they would raise a goblet to celebrate the gods. And so Christians didn't go to a lot of parties. And they got the reputation of being antisocial. They also didn't go around and condemn the culture, but their decisions condemn the culture because of their views on slaves and on women and on children. Slavery was ubiquitous throughout human history, and it was a big part of Rome. And a slave was a tool to be used, and you could easily murder one. And yet the Christian would look at that person and say, they have dignity in the image of God, and I call you brother. And when you come into this house, we are equal. And a slave became the bishop of Rome. And so Christians had a different view about the dignity of all humanity. It's not just an upper class that's sons of God. We are all children of God by his grace, right? They looked at children, and Rome saw little girls as an absorption of wealth. So if you had a little baby girl, you would throw her out in the woods to die of exposure. The Christian said, no, that little girl, that baby has dignity, and if you won't raise her, we will. And the Christians would raise these little discarded baby girls. And they had a very narrow sexual ethic compared to the culture. And it's because if you remove all boundaries from a culture, the strongest in the room wins. And when you remove all boundaries sexually, if you look culturally, it's usually guys that win and women that lose. And in Rome, men had multiple mistresses, multiple women. They were not seen as having the same value as men. And yet the Christian said, I'm going to marry one woman and I'm going to love all of her. I'm going to love her body and her soul and her emotions and her mind. I'm going to talk to her and she's going to talk back to me and we're going to be friends. And the Romans were like, that's so crazy. You guys are nuts. And so they were repulsed by it. And they were repulsed by the fact that they wouldn't worship Caesar as Lord. That's what got Christians killed. You can worship Jesus all you want. Just worship our gods too. So Christians weren't killed for believing in Christ. They were killed for believing in only Christ. And yet, even though they were repulsive to many people, there was something drawing to them, alluring to them, because they had a burning conviction. We believe the event happened, and Christianity spread because people talked about the God who saved them. They couldn't stop talking about what they'd seen and heard, and because they loved people. One said they love each other before they even know each other. That Christians would care for the poor. If you couldn't afford a burial, your body was thrown out to be eaten by beasts. The Christian said, no, that person has dignity, and they would put on burial services for the poor. That they would care for women. They would care for kids. They would care for so many people that Emperor Julian, who longed to stamp out Christianity, got so mad. He said, it's a scandal that there is not a beggar among them. These godless Galileans care not only for their own poor, but ours as well. He says, I'm trying to wipe these people out, but they're so nice. And Christianity grew because they held to their convictions. And when they were attacked, they did not attack back. That was the last reason it grew, is because they suffered well. That when a Polycarp was brought before an amphitheater in Asia Minor, they said, are you a Christian? Yes, I am. We'll kill you for that. He's like, why don't you give me a day and I'll tell you more about it. And they were like, are you serious? Like, man, we're going to throw you to the wild dogs. And he said, well, then get the dogs. And they were like, so you're not afraid of the dogs? Well, then we'll just burn you with fire. And he said, you're talking about a fire that'll last about an hour. He said, I'm talking about eternal fire. And I'd love to tell you more about a God who can rescue you from it. And he starts evangelizing. What a weird guy. And they burned him alive. But the crowd looked at him and said, who does that? Who talks like that? Who is so dismissive of their own death because they care about somebody else? We are. Did you notice the purpose and motivation in this, the perspective? So that they may glorify God on the day of his visitation. We believe that God is the ultimate judge, and God will judge everybody for what they do. And so since we know God is coming to visit us, we persuade men. That's what Jesus did. That's where we're getting this from. When Jesus was on trial, they kept trying to get him murdered. They couldn't come up with a charge, so they asked him to present one. They said, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? And he said, yes, I am. They were sitting on these high thrones judging him, and he said, you know what? You're gonna see me seated on the throne of the Ancient of Days. And so here, Jesus is on trial, about to be executed, and he's not thinking about that. He was like, you guys think you're judging me? You're the ones on trial. He said, because what you do with me matters for eternity. And then he went and he died graciously, forgiving. Father, forgive them. And at the end of it, a Roman soldier said, that has to be a son of God, because no one talks like that. So then when Paul gets arrested, they bring him in front of King Agrippa. They said, we're gonna kill you for your allegiance to Jesus. And he was like, well, you know, the prophet said that Christ must suffer and that he would be raised. And so Jesus Christ fulfilled that. He rose from the dead so that by repentance, you may have life. And King Agrippa goes, whoa, 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 whoa. Are you trying to make me a Christian? Your life's at stake. What are you doing? Are you trying to convert me? And Paul said, yeah, I mean, that's what I'm doing here. Yeah, this is ancillary. I'm gonna die somehow, but yeah, you need to know God. And so on and on, that's the Christian perspective. I'm not trying to win a small battle, I'm trying to win the bigger game going on here. Your political adversary has an eternal soul. And so you don't just fight against them. You can disagree with ideas. John the Baptist disagreed with the leadership to their face. So yes, you can say, I disagree with those ideas, this is wrong, and you can embody a different set of ideas. We're meant to do that, and we get to speak our opinions in this culture. And yet, there's a bigger game being played. That I'm fighting not just against you, I'm fighting for you. And I'm gonna embody a different set of values for your sake, because I want you to know him. So that's a hard thing to get. In the Garden of Gethsemane, when soldiers came for Jesus, what did Peter do? He grabbed a sword and tried to kill a guy, glanced his ear, clearly wasn't trained. Yeah, and Jesus is like, Peter, just stop. Wow, no, just stop, man, stop. For a lot of reasons, but stop. We are not a political coup. We are not going to advance my kingdom by violence. We are not going to burn these structures down. We're going to embody a different structure. And Peter, 2 years after writing this letter, will be crucified in Rome under Nero, right? And yet from the blood of the martyrs, the church grew. And the planet is praising the name of Jesus because of this. I'm not fighting against you. I'm fighting for you. We have had so many venues turn us down in this city because we're a church. And I remember I went to go shoot a video for this organization at a building, and the guy asked me, "What do you do?" And I said, "I'm a pastor." And he immediately, with great speed, assumed a number of political things about me. And before I could say anything, he said, "Well, if I would have known, I would have never let you come in here." And I was like, okay. I said, well, here's the crazy thing, man. I said, I live here, and you live here. I said, and I have two allegiances in my life. I love the Lord. I belong to him. And I don't get to change his word. It changes me. So I'm walking with him. And he tells me to love you. And to love you whether you agree with me or love you whether you don't. I'm going to love you. I said, so here's the question that's being put in front of you and me today. Can we exist in the same city together? Okay, maybe we disagree about some issues. Can we coexist in this city? Or do we have to pull our knives out and kill each other? I said, my king tells me to love you, even if you slay me. I said, you have to decide, is it possible for you and I to have civil discourse? I don't think he expected me to say that at all. So then I had to record this video. And as I record the video, the camera's in front of me, and if this is the camera, this is him. And I'm like, okay, you know what? This is consistent with the last 2 years. So I just preached about how the grace of Jesus Christ makes us gracious. And we do radical good because he's been so good to us. And then I just started sharing stories about what we've done through Love DC. And at the end of it, he came up to me and started visiting, and I invited him to coffee, and he said yes. And you got to endure the pain. And if you can, maybe you can work past that resistance in order to save a soul, right? I can disagree with you, and I will stand my ground and not back down, but I will stand with my convictions and compassion, because here it is, church. Conviction and compassion combined changes a culture, and that's what we're meant to do. That's who we're meant to be. What's the government's role? Sorry, we got to go fast. Sorry, folks. Why did it take so long to talk about politics and religion, Ben? I don't know. The band went long, I guess. So be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution. God has ordained government. He has structures within which society can flourish. So we obey the emperor, or submit to the emperor supreme, or to governors sent by him to punish those who do evil and praise those who do good. He's telling us this is why God ordains government. We need human structures to punish evil. To say you're not allowed to kidnap children. You're not allowed to fill your body with intoxicants and then drive a big vehicle of death. You're not allowed to steal from us, whether you do it by smashing a window or with the stroke of a keyboard. You can't take from us. We set rules and say if you violate these and hurt our society, there's repercussions for that. But they also praise what is good. And when you do good, when you help a city flourish, when you look where the fabric of society is breaking and you lean into it, like we're doing with Love DC, and I hope we run out of spots today as you sign up. When you do that, he says you're gonna earn the respect of those in leadership. Right away, maybe not, but over time, yes, because if you're governing, you're trying to get people to stop doing what is evil and start doing what is good. And even in pagan Rome, they understood that. They just didn't have a power source to live into the morality they professed through the Greek philosophers. And so they misunderstood Christians, but then they understood over time, they live better lives than us. And let me tell you something, that testimony is all through your Bible. That as you look in the Old Testament, so many believers in God were called to work in government. You see Daniel and Esther and Nehemiah and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, believers in Babylon. The people of Jesus in the public square. How do they act? They are respectful, they are kind, even to a leader who disagrees with them and who doesn't embody their values. They resist where they have to, but they do it with grace. and they're willing to die well for what they believe. And over time, what happened? Joseph in Egypt, Joseph was misunderstood, imprisoned, nobody liked him. But then suddenly, the Pharaoh looks and goes, wait a minute, that's the best guy we got here. Why are we persecuting that guy? That's the best dude we got. I'm elevating him. Daniel, the same way, respectfully declines their diet. I'm not gonna eat the food you offer to pagan gods. But he offers a solution, but just give me a test, let me do it my way, and you see if it works. And he was 10 times better, so he got promoted. All the other magicians are lying to the king. He's like, you're all liars, I'm gonna kill you all. And Daniel was like, respectfully, before you murder everybody, can you give me a week to pray about it and bring some solutions to you? He says, yes. Daniel brings solutions to Nebuchadnezzar, and he was like, where'd this guy come from? Elevate that guy. And you see all through the Old Testament, believers in God embody a different set of values that are misunderstood, but then those who are trying to govern realize these people have an internal driver that makes them do good, makes them actively serve others. Who are you? You're weird. Are you drunk? What are you doing? And then over time they go, okay, I don't know what's going on with you, but you're hired. We had a friend who lived here in DC. She did that. She did what many of you did. She moved to DC with all of her possessions packed into a tiny 4-door car. I'm gonna change the world. She got up here and became an intern, working like at a desk or under a desk or like in a cave. I don't know where, it's like, how low can you go? But she would serve. She would do her job and then help other people with their jobs. Not to get credit, but to help them win. And people are like, what are you doing? You're risking someone else being exalted. That's crazy. But she would serve people. And sure enough, there was a tour that came in and they looked a little lost and she looked around and there was no tour guide. So she just walked up and she's like, hey, can I guys help you? Not her job, not her problem. They're like, well, we're trying to find this guy, we can't find him. She's like, well, what's his name? Let me track him down for you. And she goes, tries to track him down, can't find the guy, whatever. Some dude had just bailed on this tour. And she was like, you know what? Let me give you the tour. I got it. Let me change some plans. Let me help you guys. Strangers. So she tours them around, shows them around, helps them out in this place they were visiting, and they leave. And it turns out that guy has incredible influence in the government. And she shot through the ranks and was very young, like many of you, and getting briefings that were terrifying about the country. And yet she shot through the ranks. Why? Because her conviction and her compassion is seen as a good to those in power. And so you may be misunderstood for a time, but like Daniel, like Joseph, like Nehemiah, you keep embodying your compassion and your conviction, and you'll change a culture. It's always been that way. And so then he reconciles the tensions that we live in. He says, live as people who are free. You're free. You belong to God alone. But don't use that freedom as a cover-up for evil, but be a servant because God served you. So we honor everybody, even if they disagree with you. And let me challenge you now, church, before we close. I want you to imagine your greatest political opponent. The person that when they come up on your feed, you despise them the most. Like even now, maybe some bile's coming up in your throat. You're like, oh my God, I need a Tic Tac. Does anyone have a mint? He tells you to honor that person. Peter, how dare you? You don't understand. I mean, all you had was Nero and Caligula and all right. How do you honor them? Well, Jesus said to pray for those who persecute you. So start there. And don't just pray, Lord, smite them in their wickedness. Like, I don't know, maybe pray, God, one of the greatest things you do to dissolve enemies is you turn them into friends. And so God, would you make them yours? I honor everybody. But then I love the brotherhood. So I got honor out here, and that's hard. But I've got a family. I got an inner ring. I got a community group starting this week. And I'm gonna prioritize that because I need the strength of this community if I'm gonna launch out and change the culture. You need a powerful inner ring. You need a fire that's blazing hot in the center so you can radiate out light and heat into the world. You need to love the brothers. And then you fear only God. He directs me. But then I honor those in charge. These institutions God built. And Rome had some good institutions. And some evil people filled them. And so Peter's looking at that and saying, but we're gonna honor them. I'm not gonna slander. I'm not gonna despise. I'm gonna pray for. And yeah, maybe I'll confront. Maybe I'll do what Peter did, where they told me, stop talking about Jesus when they brought him to trial. And he said respectfully, no, I can't. I've got a higher allegiance. So I'll disagree with you, but don't despise you. I'm not trying to overthrow you, but I am trying to convert you. And maybe we'll be like Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. Maybe you'll the next generation of young leaders of the government that as policies and positions and assumptions in the cultural square run cross-grain with your Christian conviction, you say, I'm sorry, I can't go there with you. And you'll be misunderstood. You'll be judged. They said, we're gonna throw you into the furnace. Your job, your reputation, you will lose. And what did they say? Respectfully, King, our God is able to save us, but even if he doesn't, we're not gonna resist you, we're not gonna pull the knives out. You do what you have to do. But as for us, we will never bow to any other God than Jesus Christ. That's our King. I can't bow to your statue. And they walked into that furnace and did not burn. And a king looked at them and said, you guys are weird, you are strange, and there's something about you I can't shake. There's something different about you. And they changed Babylon. Babylon is not as big as our King. Babylon's fall and Persia's falls and Greece's falls and Rome's fall, but this kingdom will endure throughout generations, and it does even now. So if you feel like you're losing, you're actually winning. You're part of a kingdom that races into forever, and we're meant to embody its values. So be strong, be courageous, be loving, be kind, be confusing in the best way, because God changes a culture through us as we embody his better ideas.